Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. It's the greatest threat to confront vaping, and likely you may have missed it. Over the past 18 months, a dangerous misinformation campaign has emerged, falsely linking vaping to fentanyl. It began with easy-to-dismiss reports, but in the past several months, hysteria has grown to alarming levels. It appears an orchestrated campaign is underway that includes some surprising actors who appear to be weaponizing this false narrative in a geopolitical battle with the People's Republic of China. Joining us today to talk through the details of this threat to vaping is Tony Abboud, Executive Director of the Vapor Technology Association. Tony, thanks for coming back on the show.
Brent, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you again.
Tony, I have to thank you for bringing the story to our full attention. You just delivered a bombshell presentation at the Next Generation Nicotine Delivery Conference in Miami, Florida, where you outlined in meticulous detail the unfolding of this campaign and to raise the alarm within the industry. Tell us, what's going on?
Well, what we're seeing, Brent, is a coordinated, highly orchestrated, what appears to be a highly paid for campaign that is directly tying one type of nicotine device, a disposable vaping product, nicotine vaping product, to fentanyl. And I don't need to tell you or the audience how dangerous of a term fentanyl is. Obviously, fentanyl has been and is an ongoing crisis. Overdoses in the United States number in the tens of thousands. And obviously, that is primarily in pill form or other forms. But what we noticed when we started looking at the reports that have been coming out, there are reports that involve generally described vaping devices and fentanyl. However, the orchestrated campaign that I was mentioning just a bit ago is targeting specifically Chinese-made, flavored, disposable vaping products and making statements that are very dangerous and very egregious when it comes to the allegation that these products and only these products are being imported into the United States with fentanyl to harm U.S. children.
Yeah, it's a very serious allegation. As everyone does know, that fentanyl is highly dangerous. It's 50 times stronger than heroin and is responsible for killing tens of thousands of Americans a year. So by tying vaping in any manner to this, is this another kind of EVALI?
Well, here's the comparison. We see some organic news reports from local areas that are where they are finding or confiscating vape pens, is what they call them. Oftentimes they're THC vape pens. But the headlines, of course, like with EVALI, were only talking about vaping devices or fentanyl-laced vaping devices. And so there is the parallel with the EVALI crisis where you actually have some hospitalizations of young people and in overdose cases where they've had to receive medical attention.
A warning this afternoon from medical experts who say there has been a significant increase in young people vaping nicotine and other substances, and sometimes those substances are laced with potentially deadly drugs.
A warning to parents and teenagers as doctors say more and more young people are vaping nicotine and other substances. But what they say is even more concerning. Many students are sharing those vaping pens and other devices, using them to vape THC and other illegal drugs.
The vape pens that are going back and forth between friends, you don't know what they put in there or what somebody put in there for them.
The alarming trend is being seen in the West Shore School District, where a student overdosed in the Redland High School cafeteria on Friday. According to a letter from the district superintendent, the student fortunately became responsive after 2 doses of Narcan were administered by school nurses. While the district did not specifically say what this student overdosed on, the superintendent says on occasion, vaping substances being used by students are laced with potentially deadly drugs like fentanyl, with or without the student's knowledge. Doctors with UPMC say this is becoming more and more common across the region.
It's not difficult at all to add fentanyl to a vape solution. So it's, unless you're getting your vape solution from a reliable source in a sealed container, the reality is you just have no idea what it is that you're using.
You have these hyper generalized headlines in the media that conflate the different types of vaping devices, even conflate whether it contains nicotine or THC. And now you have calls in this organized campaign for a specific public policy response or regulatory response, which is, of course, the same as it was during EVALI, which is you need to ban these flavored disposables. And the net impact, in my assessment, in our assessment, is that this poses a real threat, not only to the industry, but also it's going to scare consumers in the manner in which EVALI did. We know that EVALI was tied to illicit market THC products because of the vitamin E acetate that was put into those products. They were adulterated post manufacture, and for the reasons that unscrupulous drug dealers do what they do. We see the same pattern here, and the public reaction is going to react to what the media is talking about. So vaping generally, or now this orchestrated campaign, which is get rid of flavors that are coming into the country from China in particular, and in this one form of device, which is the disposable. And so the comparisons to EVALI are multifold. And at the end of the day, the concern and the fear is that consumers will be scared away once and for all from nicotine vaping and back to smoking.
Now, there were specific kind of bad actors, if you will, that were responsible for pushing the EVALI misinformation campaign. It really came out of the CDC, Centers for Disease Control. FDA at the time did step away from it, but they're still playing their part. Are these actors the same that are pushing this fentanyl scare too as well?
It's hard to say. I think that what we saw with EVALI and what I spoke about at the conference in Miami was the fact that the industry and the American public suffered through a misinformation campaign where there was a legitimate public health crisis. The reporting on that crisis was not accurate and specific, where you had different entities that were seeking to capitalize on that crisis so that they could achieve their own objectives. And that's where we saw the calls for banning flavored nicotine, which had absolutely nothing to do with illicit THC products. And so when you had that regulatory reaction that emanated from a lot of misinformation and the calls from some powerful people, in that case, like Mike Bloomberg and Matt Myers from the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, who went on national television and tied the two things together when they had no basis to do so, that perpetuated the ultimate decision from the White House to try to ban all flavored vaping. And now we're seeing, of course, the similar type of narrative. The difference is that the underlying stories reveal a potential issue, nothing on the scale of what we had seen with EVALI, certainly not the number of cases, but the paid for narrative or the orchestrated campaign definitely looks to be attempting to capitalize on this issue, and doing so in such a pernicious way that it will taint all vaping products and all devices of any kind, and it appears to be driven to achieve a specific purpose. To answer the earlier question, what's interesting is that there's been an ongoing campaign to eliminate flavored nicotine disposables from the market. Some of the public health groups, like the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and the Truth Initiative, really haven't jumped on that. They don't mention the issue of fentanyl very much. They have plenty of other things and pieces of misinformation that they use, as we know, but this does not appear, at least to me, to be driven by those same actors, or they don't appear to be taking advantage of the situation in the way that they did during the EVALI crisis.
Let's take a moment to walk through some of the specific articles that have recently come out, which demonstrate what you're talking about in terms of tying this to China. So the first one, Tony, that we'll look at, and here we have it in this great document you've put together on the manufactured campaign op-eds. This is in Fox News, which I certainly saw this when it came out, and I shook my head, is Dr. Tom Price. China is coming for our kids with these dangerous products. May 18th, 2023. Tell us about this.
Well, it's probably the scariest headline, the most extreme headline somebody could write. The first half of this particular piece talks about how China is bringing fentanyl into the United States to hurt American children. And it immediately pivots to e-cigarettes and how they are importing e-cigarettes into the United States with fentanyl. And some of the statements are particularly egregious, such as boosting these disposable vapes with illegal levels of nicotine to increase addiction levels among children is one thing, but adding fentanyl to them can make them deadly. And this particular op-ed, as well as the other ones that have come out, all refer to the reports generally indicate that officials have found some of the vapes laced with fentanyl. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when we looked at all of the supposed reports, none of them, except for one, even mentions a disposable vaping product. And as with EVALI, virtually all of them involve vape pens generally, or THC vape pens. And that is obviously so that statement itself is using the smallest thread to assert a conclusion that from which a conclusion cannot be drawn.
And Dr. Price, Tom Price, he's an American physician and Republican Party politician who served as the U.S. representative for Georgia's 6th Congressional District, and he was appointed by President Donald Trump as United States Secretary of Health and Human Services. So he was the top guy, the HHS secretary in 2017, with purview over vaping products.
Yes, he was. And so obviously he is a recognized figure, a national voice, and a national voice raising this kind of alarm based upon these facts is very concerning because it really just came out of the blue, right? I mean, we don't have much that preceded this except for some interesting discussion in the regulatory world that related to fentanyl. But as to actual incidents and reports, there was just scant evidence that there was any sort of threat of the nature that he is describing in this particular piece.
Now, the next piece we're going to take a look at is from June 10th, 2023, so just about a month ago, and it's titled Get Rid of Dangerous Vapes. It's from the Nevada Independent and by James Smack. Tell us about this.
Well, this is what we saw as the first in a series in June. I mean, there were all of a sudden 4 or 5 different op-eds that posted in June. One was from Mr. Smack, who I believe was the former GOP, or maybe is current still GOP national committeeman from the state of Nevada. This particular op-ed is, again, talking about the dangerousness of disposable e-cigarettes and how they are, quote, being smuggled in from communist China, and that they are especially dangerous because they may contain life-threatening chemicals, including fentanyl. These particular types of statements, even if they're characterized as may contain, is really the headline is what matters in most of these cases. But this is just one piece of this ongoing narrative. So you had the first piece by former Secretary Price, and now this other piece from Mr. Smack.
And then, so that's a Republican GOP, but we have one here from a Democrat, Senator Nan Orrock.
Yes. So again, when you see campaigns like this, or when you know there's a campaign, put it this way, you see different types of voices from different types with different stakeholder type positions. So we have a national secretary, we have a GOP national committeeman. Here is a state senator who is making, again, the virtually identical claims and talking about the danger of foreign manufacturers bringing in illegal vapes and how this is dangerous to children, and how some vaping devices are turning up with fentanyl. Again, just making the statements as if they are fact, and tying it again to nicotine vaping products, and specifically disposable products. And then immediately thereafter, right, we saw I think it was within the week, another op-ed, this one published by a father. His name was Greg Swan, and he obviously went through an enormously difficult situation with the loss of his son or daughter to a fentanyl overdose. And there's no one that would critique somebody who's had that kind of loss. But the statements he's making are very interesting here, because he doesn't, again, they're virtually identical talking points in each one of these particular stories. The headline of his particular piece is very inflammatory, as you can see from the graphic there. And it's very threatening. And again, the scare tactic through this particular type of narrative is, I think, dangerous to the overall industry, regardless of the device type that you may be interested in or that you may manufacture. And as a consumer, I think it sends a very dangerous message that nicotine vaping products are dangerous and you better stay away.
It's troubling to see this issue around disposables being co-opted. I use the word weaponized by those who are trying to do battle with China.
It's an easy narrative, right? If one wants to attack one segment of this industry, the disposable segment of the industry, which, as we know, has grown significantly in the last couple of years, this is one of the easiest ways to do it, right? Tie it into, particularly from the GOP side, the ongoing rhetoric, the geopolitical rhetoric that is hostile towards China, and play into those same concerns and those same fears of dealing with a country like China, and then make this particular issue somehow relevant in the overall geopolitical narrative that's ongoing. And so it's really taking an issue and using something that is in the current ongoing public discussion about how the government should be responding to China, what are the rational threats that China poses to the United States, and saying, look, here is a very specific threat that they pose to the United States, because, as was indicated in that first op-ed, the Communist Party in China is importing these disposable products with fentanyl in them when they cross the border to harm our children. And so, in that sense, one would believe that this effort, to the extent that it is orchestrated, is a pernicious effort. It has a strategy behind it to tie into the geopolitical narrative. and to amplify it as such. But the ramifications, regardless of what you think about disposable products, the ramifications, I think, are huge for the entire sector. I think it is very difficult, given the fact that all devices, or virtually all devices, are made in China, including those made by just about every company in the industry. I think it's somewhat fanciful to think that you're going to be able to keep this narrative as closely confined and limited to impacting just this one subsegment of the industry, particularly when the stories that come out generally refer to vapes, and the media generally refers to vapes. And we'll see the same kind of problem that we saw with EVALI, where vaping and e-cigarettes were generally thought of as being at the core of the EVALI crisis.
Yeah, at some point, they're going to weigh things down to a point where the average person, the majority, will say, this vaping is not worth the trouble. And that would be it.
That is a real concern. Personally, I said at the conference that, were this to continue and this narrative to be set in the mindset of the American public, it will be like EVALI, primarily from the perspective of people will believe that these devices are really unsafe nicotine devices, and then walk away, look for some other kind of option. One, of course, could be cigarette smoking. And I think from a regulatory perspective, it's even more dangerous, because there will be an opportunity for groups to seize on this narrative as it progresses, and use it as justification for, see, it's time now. We've dabbled with this question of vaping, nicotine and flavors. It's time to just end it all. And we know that there are abolitionists that have that objective. And I think that this kind of campaign just makes their work that much easier.
One of the things that does bother me is that this does seem to be coming from the right, which was an area for so long, going all the way back to the DC rally, had been, some hope for the vaping community, connecting with that more libertarian, maybe conservative kind of point of view. And yet now we're seeing major players from the GOP side pushing this, including Florida's Attorney General, that came out with a video and a message. And this was just on June 21st. So Ron DeSantis' Attorney General is pushing this storyline.
I'm Attorney General Ashley Moody with some alarming news. According to a just-released Families Against Fentanyl report, children younger than 14 are dying of fentanyl poisoning at a faster rate than any other age group. We're also seeing news stories about high school students suffering from complications after using vapes that might contain fentanyl. And as Florida's Attorney General, I want to encourage parents to talk to their children about the dangers associated with using drugs. Remember, any substance sold on the black market could contain fentanyl. It's in counterfeit pills, cocaine, meth, and possibly even in illicit vaping pods. Using just one time can kill.
Yeah, it's interesting that there has been some focus in Florida. There was a business trade association called the Florida Retail Federation, which published a report. We're echoing the exact same sentiments that we found in these other pieces that were being published in June. And that series, again, this is, again, the next one in the series. And they, of course, refer to what the Attorney General of Florida had to say. I don't know if it's coincidence, because the bill that would essentially ban flavored disposables was filed by a congresswoman from Florida, but or if there is some concern that there is some knowledge that Governor DeSantis, while he was governor, did veto a flavor ban and has perhaps differing views. But regardless, I think that again, the different pieces that keep coming out that parrot the same types of claims make this a narrative which could get easily set in the regulatory world, particularly when those words are coming out of the mouths of public officials.
You are so right about that, Tony. The last one that we're going to show from your document here was from the Washington Free Beacon on June 20th. And this pulls the FDA into it. So is this a part of a pressure campaign now that's being turned onto the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to kind of push them over the cliff?
Well, this one, I mean, this piece certainly takes that angle. It looks like it's trying to embarrass the FDA for taking certain actions. For example, the FDA recently made a big announcement of its 180 retailer warning letter nationwide blitz. And that announcement received a lot of ballyhoo in the media. And what's interesting is that the agency in that press release also engaged in some concerning statements tying certain products to poison by raising the issue of poison control calls. I thought that it was this gets to be particularly problematic as a narrative when, as I was mentioning before, public officials either wittingly or unwittingly play into that narrative. So to see this series of op-eds and reports that we were just talking about from the middle of May until the end of June be immediately followed by an FDA announcement which says that Elf Bar products are associated with poison, I mean, just really struck a chord. I'm not suggesting at all that the agency is somehow involved in this, but I thought it was particularly problematic at the time that they made their press release, that they used that type of rationale to justify their actions, given what had been being said.
I've noticed that there a good handful of the people that have been putting out these op-eds are from tobacco-growing states. Is that the conspiracy-minded thing going on here, or is there something to that?
I think Brent, the real question is, why is this narrative being shared in the way that it's being shared, right? What is the ultimate objective here? And when there is such scant evidence of flavored nicotine disposables being associated with fentanyl, it raises the question as to how does this happen and why? So I think that there is a lot of pressure on the industry right now. The agency itself has been heavily criticized, as we've talked about, by the Reagan-Udall Foundation. It is struggling to get control of a marketplace that it has declared as all being illegal. And this is part of the problem, right? When the agency declares that every product that it has not yet authorized, which basically means a handful of products, are illegal, then more pressure is brought to bear on the agency to remove the illegal products from the market. The challenge, of course, is the agency deciding, well, which of all of the illegal products that are out there, because according to the agency, they're all illegal, but for this handful, should it remove? And those are fair policy debates to have and fair criticisms to make of the agency in terms of the manner in which it is actually enforcing and the manner in which it is implementing its regulatory scheme. But a narrative of this kind, I think, does an enormous disservice to consumers who are using nicotine vaping products to stay away from smoking cigarettes. And we know the effect that smoking cigarettes has on you. And it is so, I guess, pernicious because of the fact that the volume of op-eds that are coming out. And then the last one that we looked at wasn't even an op-ed. It was just a story in the Washington Times. which all of this will have an effect on what regulators think. And that's why it's extremely important from our perspective that the regulators themselves be very cautious in how they talk about these products. It's bad enough that we have a regulatory structure that gives some lip service to the whole concept of continuum of risk, yet on the other hand, has massive multimedia campaigns of their own to tell children and parents just how dangerous these products are. That's why I took such great exception to this last press release that tried to invoke the poison control calls, especially when you look at the poison control data. The poison control calls for vapes pale in comparison to poison control calls for household bleach, hand sanitizer, and disinfectant. So I think that when you look at real data on these points, you see that the statements that are being made are out of step. But I think the biggest concern was when the word fentanyl came out of the mouth of the FDA Commissioner in front of Congress.
My understanding is that a lot of these products that are available in our country actually are illegally imported from China. Could you talk about your plans to get these potentially dangerous Chinese products off the market and out of the hands of our children? And could you talk about the level of confidence that you have that the flavored disposable vapor products don't contain harmful chemicals, even drugs like fentanyl?
I think this is an all-government issue. There's recently been some publicity. I think it's no surprise, but of great concern to me that fentanyl may be showing up now in vaping products. I think it was just a matter of time.
He said there's recently been some publicity. And he said he's not surprised that these products are coming into the country with fentanyl, and it was just a matter of time. Like I said, we looked at the publicity, and there was certainly no evidence prior to the time he made that statement that we have an issue of importing nicotine vaping products into the United States that contain fentanyl. So I found that to be very alarming. I think that what we have is a situation where public health officials, particularly the FDA, have a serious responsibility to not play into the rhetoric and to properly warn. So if there is a serious public health crisis, then they should tell the American public what that crisis involves. So during EVALI, we actually credited the FDA for issuing proper warnings about illicit THC products containing vitamin E acetate, whereas we chided the CDC for doing the opposite, for talking about e-cigarettes all the time, and for naming the crisis with the term e-cigarette. Here it is equally important that regulators not simply buy into public reports have suggested kind of language, but they have a responsibility to dig into those reports, understand what they're about, and they have the capability to do that before they even start suggesting that fentanyl is being brought into the United States in e-cigarettes. I said this back in 2019. If the government isn't properly warning about what the public health crisis actually is, then the public has no idea what to avoid and how to keep themselves safe. And so I think this is a very dangerous time for the industry, which is why, and if these stories continue to run, and it appears that there is a sequencing of them, because we've also seen other groups all of a sudden start to carry this message. There's a third-party group in Washington, D.C. that taken out a full-page ad in national newspapers saying it's time for the Biden FDA to close the loophole on these illegal disposable vapes from China because they're dangerous. There's a lot of money behind this effort, That's not a cheap endeavor on top of everything else that's happening. And so the ultimate question is, where does it go from here?
So, well, actually, the ultimate question for me is, who's paying for this?
Yeah, and it's like I said, there's no real way to find out who's paying for this. And I think that the public and those that scrutinize this issue just simply have to look at the basic things, which is kind of, why is this narrative being perpetuated? Who benefits from the narrative itself? Who loses from the narrative itself? And then consider what's really at play here. What's the ultimate objective? Because again, I think sophisticated folks who do public affairs understand the impact that this type of narrative can have. And that impact, I contend, will be extremely broad and not limited in the fashion in which it appears that the statements are trying to be limited.
It's kryptonite, without any doubt. So, Tony, to wrap up here, what can the industry do? What should the industry do? And what happens if the industry does nothing?
Yeah, I think the short answer is when we were confronted with the EVALI crisis, that then spawned numerous other challenges to the industry, from a public perception issue to a crisis management issue to the announcement by the president that he was going to ban flavored nicotine products, to the reactionary lawsuits by executives at the state level to ban flavored vaping products because people were getting sick and people were dying from illicit THC products. What we did at that time when we were facing an existential crisis was we mounted a very sophisticated response strategy that drew the lines where they needed to be drawn, explained the facts as they needed to be explained, and then drew attention to the ill-conceived policy response to the actual crisis, and provided some alternatives to having a rational regulatory response rather than a reactionary regulatory response to hyperbolic press statements. I frankly think that is the level of response that's needed now. It's something along the same order that we were able to put together in terms of the campaign to respond to the EVALI narrative, to respond to the critique of flavors, and to respond to the attempts to ban flavors through those various channels. And we have to do the same to make clear that we are dealing with not a nicotine vaping fentanyl crisis in the United States. And because if we let this particular narrative set, then that is what regulators will believe. And we've seen how easy it is for them to speak in those terms. But most importantly, consumers. I don't think the industry gets 3 strikes, not on this level. When you had the level of public health scare involved with EVALI and the already hypersensitive concerns about fentanyl, it doesn't take a scientist to figure out, or a statistician to figure out, or a public health expert to figure out that this type of campaign tying disposable or nicotine vaping products, because will taint the entire industry and will basically lead consumers to say, you know what, I'm done. I'm not taking this risk. It's just too great. I'm going to find something else. And there are plenty of other alternatives for consumers to turn to. We know that. So that's what we have to do. I mean, we have to clarify the record. We have to reestablish the fact that nicotine vaping products have a role to play in harm reduction, that nicotine vaping products have a role to play in smoking cessation, that there are smart, rational regulatory approaches to addressing whatever residual concerns there are about youth vaping, given the fact that youth vaping is now dropped to 2014 levels, and that there are rational restrictions other than banning them to address flavored vaping products, and making sure that adults have a choice, but also are not scared away from vaping products altogether.